Your television has graduated as we look at the 1979 test launch of the Intellivision. The Atari VCS dominated the North American home video game market in a way that few other game consoles in history have been able to claim. At its peak in the early 1980s, Atari controlled an estimated 70 to 80% of game sales in the United States. And even in the console's early years, the VCS was outselling its competition thanks to a combination of availability and sheer luck. But competitors it did have, and while Fairchild and Magnavox may have been the big players early on, it was Mattel Electronics that would sap up the bulk of that remaining market with its Intellivision. Mattel Electronics, initially a brand for Mattel and then siloed off in 1977 into a subdivision of Mattel Toys, had made a name for itself in the 1970s by pioneering the handheld electronic game field with games such as Auto Race and Football. These all proved incredibly successful, repurposing existing LED light technology to reproduce these real-world sports in an engaging and relatively effective way. And before long, the company was looking to TV games as its next space to expand into. The Intellivision, as it exists, was more or less the brainchild of the late Dr. David Chandler. By the time Chandler joined Mattel in 1977, the Intellivision project was in its initial stages, and he was quickly placed in charge of shepherding it into an actual consumer product after realizing this was no simple, dedicated console playing Pong. According to documents saved by Chandler and eventually posted on his website, papaintellivision.com, the company saw an opportunity where no game systems currently on the market could provide a graphically rich, long-lasting game. At that time, the only programmable game consoles on the market were the Channel F from Fairchild and the Studio 2 from RCA, though Atari had announced the VCS was coming. These systems were all designed around short-lived games in line with those seen on dedicated game consoles or arcade machines. Mattel started negotiating with two different semiconductor companies, National and General Instrument, about the chipset its console would use. Mattel also had a demonstration of MOS Technology's 6502 microprocessor, but ultimately rejected it as insufficient for its needs. Initially, Mattel was planning on going with National, but the semiconductor company reportedly scared Mattel into backing out of the video game project until GI sent along a very positive report that revived it in the fall with a chipset designed by GI. GI had experience with video games already, being responsible for the Pong-on-a-Chip AY3-8500, as well as a number of other dedicated console game chipsets that the company would license out to a variety of producers. The GI chipset included the CP1610 CPU, an odd 16-bit microprocessor that GI engineer Don Butler said predated the Intellivision design and had a variety of idiosyncrasies. This includes multiplexed memory and data buses, 16-bit addresses, and 10-bit instructions. To accommodate the 1610's quirks, the chipset included specialized graphics RAM and ROM memory chips, as well as a little fellow called the STIC, or Standard Television Interface Chip. The STIC was designed by engineer Steve Main, and is essentially the heart of the console, a primordial precursor to a GPU seen on a modern computer. It works by generating the display and graphics processing. This in turn allows the CPU to do the work of processing all the game data and simply update the STIC as needed with new graphical information. While the STIC wasn't intended to pair solely with the CP1610, the Intellivision would end up being its main use case. Because STIC had no graphics memory built into it, that's where the G-ROM and G-RAM chips came in. The graphics ROM chips stored a variety of built-in characters and graphics that any Intellivision game could pull from without using precious cartridge space, a similar approach to what Magnavox took with the Odyssey 2, while graphics RAM could hold game-specific sprites and other objects. Finally, the chipset contained a general system RAM chip and the audio chip, a PSG-based AY3-8914. This audio chip was put together by Steve Burstein, who Main said put together the device as a last resort as their speech-capable audio chip wasn't complete in time. The 8914 is a variant of the AY3-8910, which would end up being used in a lot of arcade, console, and computer games due to GI failing to patent its design. The Intellivision was initially announced in May 1978 as the Mattel Electronics cartridge video game, and the company intended to showcase it at the Summer Consumer Electronics Show. While the system would have had a limited distribution in 1978, Mattel was already talking up a 6-game launch, with another 12 in 1979. These plans ended up being scrapped before CES even took place at the behest of General Instrument, the company behind the console's microprocessor. Mattel's president at the time, Ray Wagner, told Weekly Television Digest that they wanted to ensure it was totally debugged before reaching stores. Instead, Mattel announced that the console would come out in 1979. Chandler's behind-the-scenes documentation paint a slightly different picture. The GI chipset for the Intellivision was simply not ready for production in time for the 1978 Christmas season, and indeed was still being finalized into the early months of 1979. Texas Instruments offered to combine efforts with Mattel and Milton Bradley using its own chipset, which was roughly equivalent to GI's, but ultimately this deal fell through, as Mattel's management felt the TI architecture would not fit its needs. TI would go on to use this architecture for its 99.4 computer. It wasn't until 1979 that the console's stick and memory chips would be ready for manufacturing, and for production, Mattel had chosen Sylvania to manufacture the Intellivision console itself. Sylvania, in turn, would get to market the console under its own label, too. On the software side, the Intellivision operating system, known as the EXEC, EXEC, was farmed out to APH Technical Consulting due to a lack of expertise and staff in-house at Mattel. Based on a demo reels developed seemingly for the January 1979 CES, when the system made its formal debut, the first games ready to be shown at that time included NBA basketball, NFL football, backgammon, Major League Baseball, Armor Battle, Las Vegas Blackjack and Poker, and Math Fun, while checkers, word fun, and horse racing were also discussed. It's important to note that even at this early stage, the Intellivision was also being pushed alongside the keyboard component, a full computer expansion that would load games and programs off cassette tape. The keyboard component would be delayed repeatedly following disagreements between Mattel and GI in terms of its design and capabilities, ultimately limping out the door in a test market release following legal threats for false advertising. Nonetheless, it factored heavily into the early Intellivision marketing campaign to stores and consumers up into the fall of 1980. While GI, Mattel, and APH raced to get the Intellivision ready for a 1979 debut, a reported shortage of chips led to a dramatic scaling back for the system's launch. Mattel Electronics would premiere it solely around the Fresno, California area alongside 4 games: Las Vegas Blackjack and Poker, Armor Battle, Math Fun, and Backgammon. In a memo held by the group of former developers known as the Blue Sky Rangers, Mattel shipped about 1,900 Intellivision units between November and December that year. Sylvania reportedly did get some units under its own branding out the door in some Mid-Atlantic stores in the Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Washington, D.C. regions, though none of these appear to have been tracked by Mattel. Retail giant Sears was a notable partner for Mattel in this test market phase. While retailer Gottschalk was also selling the units, Sears was the biggest chain in the country at the time and also ran ads in the Fresno Bee that December about the Intellivision. According to Ron Stringari, who was in corporate marketing at Sears before becoming Atari's vice president of marketing in February 1981, Sears' own internal market research found that there was a customer base interested in better graphics than Atari's console. Stringari led the effort to get the Intellivision into Sears stores, and before his departure was involved on the redesign that resulted in the Sears Super Video Arcade, a specially designed and branded version of the Intellivision that debuted around September 1981. It appears that relationship between Mattel and Sears started off early, at any rate, right there in Fresno. Mattel would begin to expand its test markets in 1980 until finally getting the Intellivision out nationally by August, but today we'll be focusing in on those first 4 releases from 1979. And there's no better game to look at first than the pack-in title, Las Vegas Blackjack and Poker. If you followed the broader Atari Archive series, then you already know Blackjack was a popular choice for computers and console games alike going back to the 1960s. Relatively straightforward rules, limited number of possible cards to keep track of, and familiar for most people interested in a computer program. Poker was less common, but still available. The Atari VCS included Poker in its 1979 Casino cartridge, for example, and Bally had a Poker and Blackjack cartridge available for its professional arcade back in 1978. The game's developer, David Rolfe, has indicated that its inclusion as a pack-in was to get around the Sanders Associate video game patent that covered any game where one moving object interacts with another moving object, something that doesn't really happen here. Including a version of these card games with the Intellivision also sent a message, though. Home video games were largely considered a pursuit for children at this time, and while publishers included some games for teens and adults, it's hard to escape kids as the main demographic being targeted. After all, people with more money could play more sophisticated coin-operated games, or possibly something on a computer. But children largely don't care about blackjack and poker. Including this cartridge with the Intellivision makes it clear from the get-go that while kids can find games they enjoy on this system, there's going to be plenty here for adults to enjoy too. Fortunately for Mattel, Las Vegas Blackjack and Poker absolutely blows away the other home versions in terms of visual design and ease of play. Rolf included what he refers to as fluff animation, with the shady-looking dealer flipping cards to players, glancing back and forth, and looking pleased when he wins a hand. Rolf said that these animations, being scripted, weren't too taxing to create. The game handily uses the Intellivision's unique controller smartly. The keypad is used to help players select which card game they want to play, right down to what rule set they want to follow, place their bets, and choose their moves. To do this, Las Vegas Blackjack and Poker comes with overlays that slide into the controller over the keypad. Many first-party Intellivision games include these, and while they're not strictly necessary on a lot of games, they're handy here. The 16-directional disc on the controller, which is ostensibly your joystick equivalent, is used here to peek at your cards in poker, though the manual suggests having the other player look away if you're in a multiplayer match. For game modes, you've got blackjack and 3 variations of poker: 5-card stud, 7-card stud, and 5-card draw. You can also select dealer's choice and let the computer choose what game you play. Your pot of money will carry over between hands and games, adding a sense of continuity to gameplay. This is, by all rights, the gold standard in gambling games in its heyday. Back to Rolf. In a 2007 interview with Intellivision World and another with Scott Stilfen, he explained that he essentially fell into making video games. He worked with a friend, Ted Michonne, on the Exidy arcade game Starfire, as well as a few others. He was also working at APH, where he developed the follow-up to Mattel's football handheld game, the aptly named Football 2, before being brought onto the Intellivision project around December 1977. He said that most of his games developed out of themes he was requested to make a product out of, often with graphics developed by someone else, though of course the developers had a lot of leeway in how they actually implemented these requests. Rolf eventually would leave APH for Activision, where he built out his own game ideas, but at this point in time he was working on Mattel's requests. Las Vegas Blackjack and Poker was his second Intellivision game. His first was Major League Baseball, which wouldn't see release until 1980. The other 3 1979 releases for the Intellivision were all done by who Rolf described as summer hires. The next of these games we're looking at is Armor Battle by Chris Kingsley. The VCS, Channel F, and Odyssey 2 all have their own renditions of the arcade hit Tank, and here we have Mattel's greatly advanced entry. Like those older cartridges, Armor Battle is strictly for 2 players, and pits the 2 players against each other in a fight with armored vehicles. The similarities break down from there, though. For one, the players aren't aiming for a set score or to try and get more points within a time frame. Instead, each player has a stock of 50 tanks, and their goal is to eliminate the entire enemy tank brigade before their own is destroyed. You don't pit all 100 tanks against each other at the same time, though. Instead, the game will bring up a playfield with 2 tanks per team and allows players to switch which is their active unit and which is on standby. The playfield isn't a static space with some barriers and mines laying around either. Rather, the game features 240 individual maps that the computer chooses randomly from. These include roads, forests, rivers, and buildings, all of which must be navigated or impact your tank in some way. A later revision to the game speeds up the tanks, which move incredibly slowly when bogged down in the first run of cartridges. The tanks themselves are also relatively durable, taking 3 cannon shots to be destroyed. Alternatively, each tank is equipped with an invisible mine that it can lay behind it once per map, and after a 5-second delay, it will automatically destroy any tank that drives over it. Armor Battle is an incredibly clever take on the concepts laid out 4 years earlier in Tank, and is one of the best multiplayer experiences on a console ripe with them. Some maps will heavily favor one side or the other, but ultimate victory comes down to who can use their tanks in the terrain most effectively. There's some real on-the-fly strategy to this game. When Mattel Electronics started publishing games on the Atari VCS, Rolf was asked to convert Armor Battle to that platform, where it came out in September 1982 under the name Armor Ambush. While this version dropped the mines, it otherwise plays very similarly to its Intellivision counterpart. To compensate, the Atari release includes an option for shots to ricochet around the screen akin to Combat's Tank Pong game type. It's not quite as nice strategically as the mine, but it's a welcome addition. Next on this lineup is Backgammon, developed by Kevin Miller. This rendition of an ancient board game came out about the same time as the Atari VCS version by Craig Nelson. While it doesn't feature all the bells and whistles of Nelson's take, the Intellivision Backgammon does excel at what it does. The computer opponent is no slouch against me, a relatively inexperienced backgammon player, though you do have a two-player option too. Most of the common elements of the game are here. You're still rolling dice to see how many moves forward around the board you can get your pieces, with the goal of moving all of your pieces off the board before your opponent does. You can still capture lone pieces to send them back to the start of the board, and helpfully, the Intellivision version limits your options to only where you have pieces, streamlining play. The disc here is used to move your cursor between pieces, while the keypad buttons allow the player to select the number of spaces they want to move, as long as it fits within your dice rolls. And they can also be used to take back a recent move, finalize your turn, or move two pieces at once if you roll doubles. Finally, the side buttons allow players to see the pip count, which is the running score for the game. You can also forfeit the match if you feel the situation is hopeless and just want to start over, and don't want to just push reset. Winning the game does cause it to play a cute little victory tune, which is a pleasant feature. While you don't get more esoteric game options like the doubling cube or acey-deucey rules like the VCS backgammon game, that doesn't take away from the fact that this is an excellent take on the board game. It's pleasant to look at, pretty easy to play once you know the controls, and can be a nice challenge for a new player. This is also one of the first titles in Mattel's licensing efforts for its games. In this case, Mattel got the American Backgammon Players Association official license for the cartridge. Later games had more famous licenses like the NFL football or NHL hockey. But that entire track for the company started here, and Backgammon got a little bit of a second wind late in the Intellivision's life, being included on the Triple Challenge cartridge alongside chess and checkers in 1987. Finally, we have the Electric Company Math Fun, developed by Chemo Yap. The Electric Company was another license pursued by Mattel, in this case for the popular American children's educational television series that ran from 1971 to 1977. Educational games weren't anything new on home consoles by 1979, as almost every single programmable game system available by this point had at least one in their library. Yep took a different approach here, putting the players in the role of gorillas running along a riverbank. Solving problems correctly keeps the gorilla on track and avoiding obstacles, while getting a problem wrong causes the gorilla to jump into the river. The gorilla can't get back out onto dry land until the player gets a math problem correct. The players set the number of problems at the start, as well as how difficult they want the questions to be, allowing players of different skill levels to compete head-to-head, and the computer will adjust the difficulty if players are having trouble or breezing through it. The keypads are used for entering in numbers, while the disc can be used for double-checking a wrong answer. While the game doesn't have the players compete directly, the manual does include directions on how you can conceivably keep track of a competitive score between two players regardless. This is admittedly not really any different functionally from math programs for VCS or Channel F, Studio 2, and Bally Arcade, but the presentation makes it seem significantly more interesting. The lack of any real incentive from a gameplay perspective to get answers correct is really the main thing missing from making this a real gem of an educational game. But as it is, this is about as good as you're going to get for a game cartridge that quizzes you on math problems. Interestingly, two different versions of the program exist. First-run cartridges required you to input the number from right to left, similar to how people actually solve math problems. But this proved counterintuitive for how one would enter the numbers in on a keypad. Later print runs flip it around so that players enter the numbers in from left to right, which is a bit more annoying from the perspective of solving problems, but much nicer for entering your answers. So how did these four games do for Mattel? While I don't have permission to post images from the cartridge sales memo, nothing is stopping me from sharing the information on it. The memo, dated November 23, 1983, covers cartridges shipped to distributors and retailers through June 1983, and is reportedly the last document produced by Mattel tracking these kinds of numbers. Very few copies of any of these games were shipped out in 1979 for the Fresno test market. Approximately 400 copies of Armor Battle, 400 more of Blackjack and Poker, plus 100 copies of Math Fun and 200 of Backgammon. Over the course of the tracked shipping years, however, you see a real trend form. For example, Las Vegas Blackjack and Poker was the pack-in title with the Intellivision through 1982, so all 2 million units sold by that point included that cartridge. Oddly, based on this memo, Mattel also produced additional copies, claiming a truly boggling jump of 8 million copies in 1982 alone. I can only assume this must be a typo, but nevertheless, the company claimed internally to have shipped 9.4 million copies through 1982, with another 2,500 in the first half of 1983. The other games seem to have been tracked a bit more accurately. Armor Battle proved to be Mattel's most popular game from this early set, shipping 571.6 thousand units through the coverage period. Math Fun and Backgammon did much worse, shipping for 147.5 thousand and 142.1 thousand, respectively. In terms of coverage, Bill Kunkel and Arnie Katz reviewed the Intellivision in two 1980 video magazine columns, and looked at two of these launch titles in the July 1980 edition. The pair gave high praise to both Blackjack and Poker and Armor Battle, calling the former a card shark's dream come true, praising the dealer's animation and speaking positively of how the graphics help walk a player through each hand. Armor Battle received a great deal of praise from the pair, calling it a fluid struggle for military supremacy that must be played to be believed. Accordingly, it received an arcade award the following year for Best Target/War Game, with the two referring to it as being in a class of its own. While the Intellivision was barely on store shelves in 1979, these four games showcase a true leap over what was already available on the market, and really showing how quickly technology was advancing in those early years of game consoles. No home game system before the Intellivision was really suited to pull off the kinds of things it does even with these four titles. And this will become even more true once the much vaunted Intellivision sports games start coming out in 1980. It's a low-key start, but the foundation for the console is already here. Next time, we'll look at the second round of test market releases, including the first three sports games.